Artificial Intelligence AI is most likely one of the most polarizing movies ever made, despite being written and directed by one of America's most beloved directors of all time. Orchestrated by also America's most beloved composer, starring Haley Joel Osment at the peak of his career, and the great Jude Law. Even after 15 years of its release, only half of the critics and audiences in general regarded it as a generally good film, more notoriously Roger Ebert, who gave the movie a perfect score and always regarded it as a great film, while the other half considers it not only one of the worst Steven Spielberg movies, but also a terrible movie. Some websites, such as WatchMojo.com, even consider it a career-ruining experience for Haley Joel Osment, even though he is still getting a lot of work and has even went on to play very popular characters. While Steven Spielberg is often known by his box office-breaking blockbusters from the summer, Artificial Intelligence AI was actually a very disappointing film at the box office, at least domestically. It received 2 Oscar nominations, but only for John Williams' score, which is fantastic, and for his groundbreaking special effects, but won neither, because Lord of the Rings. So given the film never received too much recognition, but much money on the producer's pockets, most critics hate it, most audiences find it boring and an overlong nonsensical mess. What do I think about the film? Well, it's pretty great actually. I honestly don't know why people think it's one of his worst movies. I happen to know his filmography quite well, and War of the Worlds, Hook, The Lost World, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull are all much worse movies. Sometimes he makes really disappointing or at least mediocre movies, such as The Big Fucking Giant. Anyone who says this is his worst film has clearly never seen 1941. Regardless, Spielberg is a masterful director that I admire very much, even if I personally don't enjoy his style that much. The cheesiness, the corny characters and humor, the Hollywood music that plays whenever something good is going on, the cartoon characters, especially the villains, the stupid plots. I prefer my films with seriousness and more logic, sense and grounded in reality. However, it's really hard to say that any of the movies that he has made that include such things are bad in any kind of way. But also is one of the motives AI is one of my favorite movies from him. It does not include any of those things. One of the most interesting things to mention when you talk about AI is the story behind. Originally, the story of the movie was the idea of legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, who was also a longtime friend of Steven Spielberg, and for years he tried to translate the story into a good script, but ultimately decided to give the story to Steven, since according to him it was more fit to his capabilities. Some say Kubrick was actually writing the screenplay for the film. However, after the filming of his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, was completed, he passed away, and therefore Spielberg was left with an unfinished script that he had to complete. The result being a combination of ideas that came from both. Now this might come out as a very good idea considering they are both fantastic filmmakers, especially considering Steven Spielberg teamed up with George Lucas before he lost his talent and became a soulless businessman to create some of his most famed movies, such as the Indiana Jones movies. However, Lucas and Spielberg had a very similar style in the past. Kubrick, on the other hand, was a polar opposite. All of his movies are more like an intellectual journey rather than a physical adventure that takes you around the world for a breathtaking experience, and that focuses more on a common theme rather than an auto-conclusive, straightforward story. In fact, his most iconic movie moments involve a very long scene with nothing particularly fantastic happening. On the other hand, Steven Spielberg is much more known for exploiting special effects to tell his story. Not that there's anything wrong with this, I just want to point out how different they are. Steven Spielberg movies always had a very easy way to form an emotional connection with the audience, while Stanley Kubrick wanted his audience to think what the point of the story was. His style, his stories, his dialogue, and his directing style would often need further analysis and interpretation in order to make that emotional connection. You can find the Riders of the Lost Ark very exciting for obvious reasons, but you won't find Doctor Strange funny unless you have a very dark sense of humor and know a lot about the Cold War, which is what makes it funny. In Saving Private Ryan, you see dozens and dozens of soldiers dying horribly in a terrifying situation, making the film a moving tragedy. In Paths of Glory, you only see the story focusing on 3, but the story is equally as tragic because of the implications of what happens to them. Schindler's List is one of the most emotional films of all time because of the characters and the story and the historical relevance it has. 2001: A Space Odyssey is also one of the most emotional films of all time, but only once you realize the entire story is about knowledge, the limitless potential a life form has with enough knowledge, and what we as a species have done with it. So now that I have established how this film is the product of 2 very different geniuses that represent the best of the greatest, let's see how well Spielberg managed to tell this story. First off, the special effects are great. Despite the film came out over 15 years ago, they still hold up just fine. Everything from the makeup, the practical effects, the sets, and even the CGI still look fantastic. I was especially impressed by the looks of the androids in the film, who are clearly computer generated, yet the way they blend with the actual tangible things in the film is really impressive. Then there's the cinematography and the level of noise, which is surprisingly quiet and simplistic. One will think that the blockbuster master himself will aim for something with more movement. However, since AI, artificial intelligence, started off as a Stanley Kubrick project, I think Spielberg is trying to use Stanley Kubrick's signature visual style, often leaving the camera motionless and only moving it to follow up the character's movements, creating a very long scene to only let you focus on the dialogue and the performances. I like the fact the film lets the characters and the story progress with simple interaction and dialogue. There are some instances in which the film is in turmoil, particularly when our protagonist goes to the city, but generally the film is actually very quiet. Just like a Stanley Kubrick movie, it wants you to focus more on the context, the story, the tone, the characters and the dialogue, rather than a ride filled with fun. I applaud that Spielberg actually tried to challenge himself when he made the film. Overall, the visuals of the film are very great. Emphasis on visuals and not the entire presentation, because artificial intelligence has a gigantic problem. It's too damn bright. Again, maybe Spielberg's idea and intention was to imitate Kubrick's style. At many points of his movies, Kubrick will let the camera right in front of the light source. Sometimes the entire room in the shot had a very bright white light. However, in AI, the usage of light is so exaggerated it prevents you from seeing everything else. And it's not just one shot, this happens again and again. I don't know whose decision it was, but it's certainly something that hurts the movie, especially because it doesn't let you appreciate the many things in the sets, such as the design. Speaking of which, AI has a very generic design when it comes to the city featured in the film. It was most certainly inspired by movies such as Blade Runner that also featured the design of a futuristic city. But the city's design in AI is honestly nothing special. I'm actually glad they don't focus too much on the city and the main characters only spent a couple of minutes in it, because it honestly will only prolong the already long runtime. It's nothing special to be actually memorable, but it's certainly not too ambitious to the point it becomes bad or it fails to deliver, it's just there. Also, I like the fact it's only a city like Las Vegas in the United States. The rest of the world in AI looks very normal. The rest of the science fiction in the film is trying its best to stay in reality. It's not a hardcore science fiction film, but more of a what will happen if humanity reaches this level of technology. Science fiction is one of my all-time favorite genres, or perhaps should I call it a subgenre, since it does not necessarily carry a film by itself and you can even combine it with everything else. Drama, action, thrillers, horror, all science fiction stories have a great opportunity to present a vision of the future. Some movies age quite a bit due to their scientific inaccuracies, but some of their predictions reflect man's ambition for self-improvement. Sometimes common fears created by mankind's very own ignorance, and other times they can even show humanity's interest for discovery. You could even say science fiction predicted outer space exploration, because science fiction is nothing but something that comes out right of humanity's imagination and thoughts. In film, you can be 1. As creative as possible with your concept and see how much you can stretch it and complicate it to tell your story, or present thought-provoking philosophical themes and existence itself, and invite your audience to challenge the way they think by asking questions. While not the best, AI is definitely one of the latter. The story begins when the CEO of a company specializing in the creation of androids for human consumption and service, known as the Professor Hobby, decides to create a childlike android that is capable of receiving and giving back love.
I propose that we build a robot who can love.
This is a very interesting premise and presents the main theme of the film, which is showing love as more of a need rather than an emotion, and the constant pursuit of many men and of course our main protagonist to satisfy this need. This is a very fascinating opening scene, because it raises many questions that will keep coming back during the entirety of the film, not just because of the things the scientists ask to each other, but also because our protagonist David is designed as a product, a tool that satisfies a need.
Love. Love like the love of a child for its parents. I propose that we build a robot child who can love, a robot child who will genuinely love the parent or parents it imprints on with a love that will never end.
They even mentioned that the only reason they keep creating androids is because they sell them to feed many human cravings.
But we ship thousands of lover models every month.
Of course, your own best customer, Shiachu-sama.
Quality control is very important.
Essentially, the film is presenting humanity as selfish and makes you wonder if we have feelings. Again, this is something that will keep coming back from time to time. Is then that the Swinton family decides to purchase David, after their only son Martin is left comatose and expected to be left a vegetable. The family's mother, Monica Swanton, is skeptic about the idea at first, even looking down at David as some kind of abomination.
Accept this! There is no substitute for your own child!
You don't have to accept it or even try. It's not too late to take him back.
How are you thinking?
I'll do whatever you want me to
You
do.
think I can just...
But slowly starts to calm down when she witnesses David's innocent and childlike behavior, until she's completely convinced that David is an actual child. During their time together, David tries his best to learn and adapt as much as he possibly can from his adoptive parents.
Would you like me to sleep now?
Good idea. Good idea. Monica?
Well, it's late, you know, it's after 9, so...
Yeah? Fantastic.
How late do they let you stay up?
Is then that you are completely convinced that he isn't very human-like, because he isn't presenting a personality of his own, or any kind of wish. He's merely imitating human behavior, the one he has observed until this point. Later on, Monica decides to use a special code that will forever program David to become the idealized loving son, with the main purpose of giving and receiving back the love from his mother.
Is it a game?
Now, I'm gonna read some words, and, they won't make any sense, but I want you to listen to them anyway.
Successfully making him more pleasant to interact with.
Mommy.
Who am I, David?
You are my mommy.
This raises a question. Was it selfish for Mr. Swanton to use the code on David? Even if he is an android, he was forced to adapt a will and a purpose based on her decision and her wishes. His own mind, his own opinions and desires were completely ignored. And it's one of the saddest parts of the film, because it makes you wonder if any of the things David is doing are coming from his own will, or only as a consequence of Monica using the code, making him basically a puppet. On a subsequent day, the family receives news. Martin woke up from his coma and is expected to make a full recovery. Much to his discontent, he finds David, realizes he isn't a human, and evidently feels jealous. Marty's only purpose then becomes to get rid of David. First, he provokes him to start an eating competition, resulting in David malfunctioning. He tricks David into believing cutting some of his mother's hair will somehow make her love him more.
I want a lock of Mommy's hair. I'll share it with you. And if you had it and wore it, she might love you even more. Like the princess in the movie we saw. When she had the prince's hair in her necklace thing, he loved her. We can ask her. No, it has to be a secret mission.
Only for her ending up thinking David is dangerous.
David! Why did you do that? Why did you do that?
What are you
Talk to me!
finally scaring David and accidentally putting Martin in a very dangerous situation.
This isn't gonna hurt. I'm not gonna cut your skin. Just tell me when you feel it.
Keep me safe, Martin. Keep me safe. Let me go! Keep me safe, Martin. Let me go! Mom! Mom! Mom!
Henry!
Now it seems David is no longer necessary. It also makes you think that maybe if the Swanton parents will have been more responsible, teaching David more about the human condition and educating Martin to appreciate him and accept him the way he is, none of this will have happened. This part of the film can even be considered an allegory for an adopted child or a son with a mental disorder or a disability, trying not to be a nuisance for his parents and everyone around him. But in the end, the Swantons don't seem to see anything redeemable in David, and when he is no longer needed and becomes a nuisance, an obstacle, he is disposed of.
Hey, David, I was thinking that we could go for a drive tomorrow in the country. You and me. What do you say?
And Teddy?
Yeah, and Teddy. You'll have to be here by yourself.
Alone?
With Teddy.
No. No, 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 no.
You...
No, Mommy, please, no, no. Please, no,
They would
Mommy,
destroy
no.
you, David.
No,
David,
Mommy,
they were gonna
Mommy,
destroy
no. I'm sorry I broke myself. I'm so sorry I cut your hair off. And I'm sorry I hurt you. And Martin, I hurt you.
Monica never truly cared for David. She was just trying to fill the void that the absence of her only biological child left. And when that's no longer necessary, she abandoned him, just like a person that abandons an unwanted pet. We later find out that the forest she left him in is a very common place for robots to be thrown away in, and it makes you realize just how many people have ignored the fact that these are all basically life forms as well, and get rid of them like garbage anyway. We are then introduced to my favorite character in the entire film, Gigolo Joe, played by Jude Law. He's an android that literally plays the role of a male escort. And I say that Jude Law's performance is my personal favorite in the film because just like the character he's playing, he's charismatic, he's energetic, charming, has a very elegant way of speaking, and everything in his character screams manly, just like his character is supposed to be. And the way he's presented is extremely effective. All his character traits are presented visually. He changes his appearance to be more appealing to his customer. He acts like a gentleman to attract the ladies, but also comes off as comprehensive and polite so they will have a shoulder to cry on.
But you deserve much better in your life. You deserve me.
However, when one of his clients is murdered by an abusive, jealous husband, he comprehends that he will be most likely blamed. And since he's a robot with no rights, there will be no trials or investigations of any kind. Understanding that he has no place in society and that the police will look for him to destroy him, he leaves the city and goes to the forest where all the other banished androids and robots are, giving this co-protagonist a perfect chance to meet with David. I like this kind of visual storytelling very much, because not only is the best way to present your characters and make them believable, but also saves a lot of screen time to an already long movie by avoiding completely unnecessary exposition. Now the members of a certain spectacle square, of which I will talk about more later, try to capture the androids and robots on what seems to be a hot air globe that blends with the horizon by looking like the moon. I like the idea of it, and it does look great. However, I think it belongs more in a fantasy-style movie, more than in a science fiction film with semi-realistic tones. I'm pretty sure it will be very easy to realize it's not actually the moon, since it's so close to the ground and at night you could probably see the real moon. But it's still a good idea and it looks great, so not many complaints. So when these androids can no longer serve their original purpose, the humans still use them to feel other kind of craving, entertainment. It is very clear that humans see androids as a pale, inferior imitation of themselves, and when androids come even a little close to resemble them, they perceive this as a disgraceful, horrid, and even sinful attempt to imitate their so-called perfection. So they use the less efficient androids as disposable tools to produce adrenaline-inducing entertainment, a mindless, harmless, consumable product that they can enjoy without ever questioning their reasons or themselves, and apparently only destroys useless pieces of junk. Does it sound familiar? Then David is capable to make the audience feel sorry for him.
Don't burn me! I'm not Pinocchio! Don't make me die! I'm David! I'm David! I'm David!
Mecca, don't plead for their lives! Who is that? He looks like a boy!
Built like a boy to disarm us!
Now this might seem like Deus Ex Machina, but I think the intention of the scene is to show how self-centered the masses are. They don't really care for David, they stopped the event because their enjoyment vanished when they started to feel guilty now that a voice begging for its life can be heard. And thus they do something so that the guilt can go away. It might seem to you that I'm overanalyzing things, but I think this way because selfishness and satisfaction seems to be the main theme of the film. Again, maybe it was what they intended this scene to be, but in my opinion Spielberg has never been a very good creator of complex stories or subtleness, so the scene came out a little corny, at least for my taste. Stanley Kubrick movies always feel like they take place in the cold, indifferent reality, and that's probably what AI should have been. There are a couple of scenes like this one in which the movie becomes a little too corny for its own good. In any case, David tells Joe about the story of Pinocchio that he read about earlier, explaining he wants to find the blue fairy of the story, who might be able to transform him into a real boy so he can go back home and regain the love of his mother. Finding himself with nothing else to do and in need for shelter himself, Joe takes David to the big city where they might find answers.
Class robots who have no idea how to live, can't even speak English, all made in Sweden. Couldn't tell a joke from a poke.
Once there, they both go to see the hologram equivalent of a pay-per-view Wikipedia.
Starving minds, welcome to Dr. No, where fast food for thought is served up 24 hours a day in 40,000 locations nationwide.
I don't like the design of this machine since I'm usually against the usage of holograms in science fiction movies, because most of the time it's just an excuse to rely on CGI, rather than come up with an interesting artifact or a concept or a gadget. But in this case I think it's handled just fine. It's not the best gadget I have seen in this movie, or much less in science fiction in general, but it's kind of necessary to move the story forward. At the cost of one more coin, the machine tells David about the blue fairy from Pinocchio, and suggests that he can only find her at the end of the world. Manhattan.
Is quite possible. Our blue fairy does exist in one place and in one place only. At the end of the world where the lions weep. Here is the place dreams are born.
Many a Mecca has gone to the end of the world, never to come back. That is why they call the end of the world Manhattan.
And that's why we must go there.
Huh? This kind of comes out of nowhere, since it was never really established before that this future has destroyed, corrupted or abandoned locations that used to be cities or important places. But if you ask me, it's not really necessary, since the year the story takes place in is also never mentioned. So we can all assume that many things have happened in this reality, one of them being the absolute destruction of Manhattan. Then we get to witness Joe reasoning about his own existence to persuade David.
What if the blue fairy isn't real at all, David? What if she's magic? The supernatural is the hidden web that unites the universe. Only Augur believe what cannot be seen or measured. It is that oddness that separates our species. Or what if the blue fairy is an electronic parasite that has arisen to haunt the minds of artificial intelligence? They hate us, you know. The humans. They'll stop at nothing.
And this is where I was convinced this character is my favorite. The fact that he is capable of reasoning in a completely non-selfish, logical way separates him from all the other androids seen thus far. He wasn't blindly complying his functions, he was just surviving in the only way he could. And since he can be reasonable, he can detach himself from the purpose he was created for and act freely. So after stealing a helicopter to escape from the police, they arrive at Manhattan. Or at least what is left of it. David finds an identical model of himself.
Are you real? I guess.
However, the sole thought of having a potential replacement angers him to the point of destroying the other copy as a measure to erase the threat. It's then that Professor Hobby shows up, congratulates him and reveals he purposely left clues in his brain that were in the info machine that will lead him there, since all of them are connected to the Pinocchio fairy tale. And this presents a paradox. David has been pursuing his dream of becoming a real boy. He's extremely disappointed when he learns he isn't one of a kind. Yet the professor tells him that his actions have made him one of a kind.
The ability to chase down our dreams. And that is something no machine has ever done until you.
I thought I was one of a kind.
Because he's the only one that has made it thus far. However, that isn't enough to convince him. Devastated for losing his motive to exist, David tries to destroy himself. But in the water he sees something that renews his hope. So when Joe saves him and brings him back to the surface, David asks him to send him back. Unfortunately, he's captured right before sending him down, and bids farewell saying,
I am.
I was!
Which means he knows he will be destroyed, but wants to be remembered. Now we get to the most disliked and heavily criticized part of AI, a section so legendary hated. When mentioning the film, this part is the one that ultimately made most audiences and critics regard the movie as bad, and that is of course the ending. Many have blamed Steven Spielberg, who has always been an audience pleaser that simply wanted to give a happy ending. But turns out Stanley Kubrick was the one who decided to have it in the film. What David saw before was a sunken amusement park. In said place, there is a section with statues and monuments representing popular fairy tales, and the already recurring Pinocchio. After going further, David finds the blue fairy statue, and starts begging her to make him real. His delusion prevents him to notice he's speaking to an inanimated object. Or perhaps he wants to ignore that fact. And right when it seems the film will end, our narrator tells us 2,000 years passed and the seas eventually froze. Then we see what seems to be spaceships heading towards the frozen body of David, who is still functional despite being frozen. The extraterrestrial creatures reanimate David, analyze his memory data, take him to an exact replica of his old house, and inside he finds an actual talking blue fairy, who was waiting for him and wants to grant him a wish. David, of course, wishes to become a real boy, but when the fairy tells him that isn't possible, he demands his mom to be brought back. She responds that in order to do so, she needs a DNA sample.
Why can't you bring back her?
Because we can only bring back people whose bodies we dig up from the ice. We need some physical sample of the person, like a bone or a fingernail.
Teddy reveals he still holds the hair David was tricked into cutting in the first part of the film. So yes, she is brought back. Now I personally think the common consensus among the haters of the film's conclusion is the fact that they only see an extremely exaggerated and nonsensical case of Deus Ex Machina, of which Spielberg is very known for, that is, ignore all the logic that you can possibly ignore in favor of giving the audience their happy ending. And I say this because I actually think the ending is fantastic. Of course, I have my own reasons to think this way. I have seen the movie many times and I always reach the same conclusion when I analyze the ending. So allow me to explain. The entire point of the film was David pursuing his dream of becoming a real boy so he could be loved by his adoptive mom, Monica Swanton. But what is exactly a human being? What is David missing? What does David mean in order to be considered a person? From the beginning of the film, we are presented with abundant examples of human behavior. The couple's biological son, Martin, did everything he could to make his parents get rid of David, and convinced them he was completely unnecessary, useless and dangerous. But why? Because he considered David a threat that could erase the usefulness he had for his parents and treated him as such. He instinctively acted in self-defense when his environment was compromised. And what happens when David encounters a potential threat to his uniqueness that could also replace him?
I'm David! I'm David! I'm David! I'm special! I'm unique! I'm David! You can't have it!
During his journey, he receives a considerable amount of help when he looks the most fragile and defenseless, as if he was recurring to others' guilt when he needs protection.
Don't burn me! Don't burn me! I'm not gonna hook you! Don't make me die! I'm David! Henry!
Then there's the satisfaction of needs, cravings and desires. And this is something Teddy and Joe never show. At some point, it's shown that Professor Hobby designed David in the exact same likeness of his deceased son, and it was him that planted the clues that will lead David to him.
At least as real as I've ever made one, which by all reasonable accounts would make me your blue fairy.
You are not her. Dr. No told me that she would be here, the lost city in the sea at the end of the world.
That's what Dr. No needed to know to get you to come home to us. And it's the only time we intervened.
And when he arrives, he says,
My son was one of a kind. You are the first of a kind.
He wanted to replace the son he lost in order to recover the love he was no longer receiving, never caring about the free will or thoughts the androids could have.
The oldest one of all. But in the beginning, didn't God create Adam to love him?
David never had the ability to choose his own existential purpose. He was forced into becoming what he is, especially with things such as the code. He was programmed to love and seek the love of his adoptive mother. And now, David is doing the exact same thing. The aliens clearly said human life has vanished from planet Earth. His real adoptive mother died centuries ago, which means this person is in fact an imitation of a human, a replacement with the only purpose to satisfy David's need for love. And since the aliens could see all his memories, we can easily assume she was also giving those memories artificially, because even if she was a perfect biological copy, she couldn't possibly be the same person. In other words, he ignores all the possible freedoms this artificial being may have, and defines her only purpose in life based on his own desires. So at this point, David is acting as human as he possibly can. Therefore, the film has made and concluded its point.
If a robot could genuinely love a person, what responsibility does that person hold toward that mecha in return? It's a moral question, isn't it?
The oldest one of all. But in the beginning, didn't God create Adam to love him?
Is it a Deus Machina? No. The blue fairy isn't actually there, it's the aliens that show this to David in order to trick him and keep observing his behavior because they are fascinated with the human race in the same way humans are fascinated with extinct species like dinosaurs.
Nations of the meaning of life in art, in poetry, in mathematical formulas. Certainly human beings must be the key to the meaning of existence, but human beings no longer existed. So, we began a project that would make it possible to recreate the living body of a person long dead from the DNA in a fragment of bone or mummified skin.
Is it a poor excuse to make a happy ending? No, because it makes a very harsh statement on the human condition. At the beginning of the film is also made perfectly clear that David cannot and doesn't need any sleep. So I believe it's perfectly safe to assume he decided to stop functioning. After all, his purpose was fulfilled, and the new mother the aliens provided will not live another day. Many will think a machine will not be able of feeling or emitting emotions such as love. In fact, that's what makes all the humans in the film look down on all the androids and robots. But honestly, we might be mistaking emotions with instincts, and the androids clearly have shown instincts. And is love really something special that only humans can experience because they're special? Or is it just a chemical in the brain to which we give a name and meaning in order to convince ourselves that we're special somehow? The movie makes you ask such questions, but lets you enough space to think and find an answer for yourself. AI might have a script and a tone that collides with the artistic vision of two completely different filmmakers, but I consider it one of the most misunderstood and poorly judged movies made by Steven Spielberg. It might not be a masterpiece by the standards of many, including myself, but it does present premises and themes that makes you think, and enough story and development to help you answer those questions. And that for me is what makes it a thought-provoking and deep science fiction film. Rest in peace, good Joe. Rest in peace. One last thing that I want to point out is how beautiful the ending credits are, because you get to digest most of the things you have seen while you listen to John Williams' magnificent score, which is in my opinion much better than the corny orchestra compositions he has made. And also because you remember the main reason Steven Spielberg decided to pick up the movie, write the screenplay himself, and direct it was because he was a long-time friend of Stanley Kubrick. And at the end, he decided to leave him this.